Hey everyone, it's Trent here again, and today I'm excited to get into the topic of seed oils and heart health. Specifically, in this part, it's dietary fats explained, really the foundation of this conversation. And when I was looking at the best way to speak about seed oils and heart health, I realized that I almost have to separate it into three separate parts. This is going to be the foundation, a lot of the language, and a lot of the kind of boring behind the scenes work that I feel is important because when we talk about such a nuanced and debated topic like this, a lot of the times people go into it not really knowing what they're talking about. So, this is going to be once again the foundation. The second part is all about heart health, and I just finished making that PowerPoint. That one is it's just a monster of a PowerPoint. And the third part is actually going to be the conversation surrounding seed oils. But once again, I feel that we need this foundation to stand strong on, and that way we can really look at different sides of the conversation, different impacting factors, and basically so you can know what you're talking about a little bit more than just picking one side versus another. So, with that said, let's go ahead and get started. Why is fat so controversial? Dietary fats have been constantly looked to for their impacts on heart health. From the mid-late 1900s shift away from saturated fats, the trans fat controversies of about the last 20 to 30 years, to modern day seed oil conversations about the last 5 to 10 years, there's always constant debate. And you might have even lived through some of these changes. The shift away from saturated fat changed a whole agricultural business model. I mean, we went from whole milk dairy products all the way down to low fat everything, and low fat was the goal. It was low fat, and then it became low fat high protein, but these changes impact millions of Americans, so it is a pretty big thing. To properly assess the topic and to not argue outcomes before understanding biochemistry and metabolism, a deep look at fats must be undertaken from the ground up. And so that's why I felt that this PowerPoint was so important, is we're actually going to look at each single component of fat to really understand what we're talking about, and then we can have different nuanced conversations. So, what dietary fat actually is. And there's going to be a good amount of chemistry, biochemistry names. I'll try to simplify it as much as possible because it can really get boring. But what we're starting off with here is most dietary fat is in the form of triglycerides, consisting of a glycerol backbone with 3 fatty acid chains attached, providing 9 kilocalories per gram, right? Or when we say 9 calories, like on a label, that's the same thing as kilocalories. This is also the major form of fat within stored adipose tissue as well. So if we look to the right here, this is a triglyceride. We have a glycerol backbone here, and then we have 3 fatty acid chains. And what we're really going to be focusing on is these fatty acid chains here and the difference between them. So fatty acid structure, specifically within the carbon-carbon bonds. So if we look here, we have a carbon to carbon bond with hydrogens attached. Carbon, 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 so on and so forth. And we're going to be looking at when we change these carbon-carbon bonds, what changes with the actual impact on health, so on and so forth. So we're looking at how these carbon-carbon bonds can affect membrane fluidity, oxidation susceptibility, signaling, and lipoprotein, think about cholesterol, response. With that said, why do we need fat? Fat is a key determinant within many biological systems, ranging from cell membrane structure, steroid hormone synthesis, absorption of fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, K, nervous system support, myelin sheaths, which are just, think about it, we need fat as a propagation system so that way we can actually send nerve transmissions at a fast enough speed. And energy reserve, especially for long-term oxidation bouts. This is a fancy way of saying, hey, if you don't eat anything for a long period of time, or if you need to go walking for 3 hours, you have to have the ability to burn something. It's not going to be glucose most of the time or sugar. It's going to be fat, right? Whether you just ate it or from storages. So that gets into its own physiological, really deep biochemical properties, but just know that we need fat to burn. And there's actually essential fatty acids in the form of omega-3 and omega-6, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But some fats are essential, meaning our body cannot produce them. So let's go ahead and open up this research article here. So what we have here is a very simple little article, but this is just looking at some of the reasons why we need fat, kind of harping in more on the fats that our body can't make on our own. So those essential fatty acids. The fat helps us store energy, insulate us, protect our vital organs. Really what I wanted to go down to was the membrane formation. So cells and mitochondria within the cells, but think cells have a cellular membrane. And I'm not going to go too much into detail here, but this is a cool example of a cellular membrane. And what we have here is a lot of different fat components. If we zoom in even more, Well, we have a bunch of these little beads with strings on the beads. These are called phospholipids. So it's pretty much just like those triglycerides I showed you, except on that glycerol backbone, there's a phosphate group, and instead of 3 fatty acid chains, there's 2 fatty acid chains. So right here. And when we eat fats, our body can incorporate those fats that we eat into the cellular membrane in the form of phospholipids, right? And within the cellular membrane, we also have other components like cholesterol that helps for, if basically the best way I can describe it is if the environment gets too cold, it helps make sure that our cellular membranes don't freeze up. If it gets too hot, it makes sure that they don't melt, right? So they help fluidity of the membrane because we need it a very specific way. But one of the big impacting factors of dietary composition is the impact on cellular membranes. And once again, it's not surrounding only every cell, it's also surrounding the mitochondria. And the mitochondria actually has 2 cellular membranes. So it's just a quick example of this is where it can get really detailed, but it's important to know that fats are vital for our functions, and the fats that we do eat do have a pretty big role in the biology outcomes of a lot of different functions, like specifically the mitochondria. That's a big thing, but we'll touch more on that later. So that brings us to main types of fats. Double bonds, specifically within those carbon-carbon bonds, which I'll explain over here, change shape, flexibility, and susceptibility to oxidation, leading to structure directly influencing function. So this is a basic overview of some of the different kinds of dietary fats. We'll get into a little bit more of this article. But what we have here is the triglyceride that I showed you prior. What you can't see is this is the glycerol backbone, and then each one of these little points where the line changes up and down, that is a assumed carbon, right? So those C's that you saw in the last slide, there's a carbon here, carbon here, so on and so forth. And on each one of those carbons, there are associated hydrogens. So when we go here to saturated fats found in things like butter, cheese, ground beef, what we have here is a line that continuously goes up and down. And what this means is each one of these carbons has the maximum amount of hydrogens that can go onto it, right? So we have a carbon here with 2 hydrogens because it can make 4 different bonds, right? So we have 1 bond to another carbon, 1 bond to another carbon, and 2 hydrogens. That's saturated, meaning it's saturated with hydrogen. When we go to monounsaturated fats, this means there is mono, 1, unsaturated. So there's one area of this chain where carbons do not have the maximum amount of hydrogens. Instead, they have an additional bond to the carbon next to them. So right here, we have a double bonded carbon, a carbon double bonded to another carbon. What this means is there's less hydrogen, so it's unsaturated. Common examples of monounsaturated fats, things like olive oil, avocado oil, or even in avocados, like that. Continuing on, polyunsaturated fats, poly meaning more than one, unsaturated meaning some of the carbons don't have hydrogens, mean that we have multiple different kinds of double bonds, more than one. So a polyunsaturated fat just means we have more than one double bonded area in the chain. Talking in terms of omega acids, right, omega fatty acids, if we look at the last carbon here, because this is considered the last carbon, so we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is an omega-6 acid. Although I'm counting 1 to 6, this is technically the last carbon. So if this was an 18-chain carbon, we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 from the end. I don't know why it's like this. This is just the nomenclature behind it. But polyunsaturated fats, think seed oils, vegetable oils, omega-3 fish oils. So when you say polyunsaturated fats, you're kind of including a large amount of fats from a lot of different sources. We'll get into more of that later. Trans fats, as we see here, containing carbon-carbon double bonds in a trans rather than a cis configuration. What that means is if we go back up to monounsaturated fats, we have the double-double bond where if we were to put a hydrogen there and a hydrogen there, it's on the same side. If we go down to trans fats, you see how a trans fat looks like a saturated fat in terms of it going up, down, up, down, up, down, but there's a double bond there. So trans means we have a hydrogen on one side opposite from the other. And the reason why this is so important is because this mimics the states of a saturated fat. So a saturated fat, think butter when you sit it at room temperature. Yeah, you can, slice it with a butter knife, but it's still solid. Monounsaturated fat at room temperature it's more of a liquid. Olive oil is, it's a huge liquid, right? And that's because saturated fats, when you have the chain that go up, down, up, down, up, down like this, you can stack them on one another. Very simplified explanation. But when you can stack them on one another, they're less susceptible to turning into a liquid at room temperature. Monounsaturated fats, because of this configuration where there's think of like a kink in the chain, you can't stack them as appropriately, which means it turns more into a liquid at room temperature. Trans fats with a double bond, they still mimic saturated fats, so they'll act like a saturated fat at room temperature. Things like, I can't believe it's not butter. Well, it's not butter, right? It's a trans fat, which means it's a human modified product to mimic saturated fats. But these double bonds in this configuration that our body is not used to is very damaging. That's another topic entirely, but just explaining some of the nomenclature behind this and the reasons why we look out for things like trans fats, because it mimics a saturated fat. So let's go ahead and keep going. Open up this article. All right, so what we have here is a really long article. Not going to go over it in its entirety. Once again, I'll link everything in the description if you want to. But I wanted to use this as an example of starting the conversation around it's not just the amount of fat that you have that can determine a health outcome. Meaning we have one person with 50 grams of fat they ate per day, another person with 20 grams of fat they ate per day. Well, if they eat less fat, they're going to be less fat and they'll be more healthy. There seems to be not a general consensus following that route. It's a lot more context dependent and nuance, which is a really big factor in terms of the conversation that we're leading to. I wanted to scroll down a little bit more on the trans fats that we were talking about earlier. The Institute of Medicine determined that there is no safe level of consumption of industrial trans fats from partially hydrogenated oils. An example can be like vegetable shortening, right? That is very high in trans fats. They adversely affect a diverse range of cardiovascular disease risk factors. They raise LDL-C cholesterol, raise triglycerides, lower HDL-C, increase inflammation, promote endothelial dysfunction, and may promote hepatic fat synthesis, resulting in far greater risk of developing cardiac heart disease than any other macronutrient. So, because they have that composition that we talked about, that tiny little difference in are the hydrogens on the same side or are they opposite, you have huge health outcomes. And this is vital. We're going to continuously bring this point up over and over again. But remembering something like trans fats, the difference in fat composition has a huge impact. I'll say that a million times because that's a really big point to harp home. So scrolling down, just for the conclusion, we presented evidence that the types of foods consumed and the overall dietary pattern followed are far more important for reducing cardiovascular disease risk than total fat, right? And they also include differences in carbohydrates. Once again, you can go ahead and read the study in its entirety if you want, but helpful plant and seafood sources of monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats have important health benefits in the context of a healthy dietary pattern. So there's the same thing once again. We're going to continuously talk about this, bring it up, explain why, explain heart disease. But here's an example of, hey, it's not as simple as all fats are the same, because they really are not. All right, so I thought it would be good to look at a quick language guide concerning polyunsaturated fats. So remembering, if a chain has more than one of those double carbon bonds, this is a polyunsaturated fat. So umbrella term is polyunsaturated fats. You can think of things like omega-3s and omega-6s where the last double bond is, kind of like I explained before. Omega-6 specifically is known as linoleic acid, whereas omega-3s are known as linolenic acid. They almost sound the same, but omega-6 is linoleic, omega-3 is linolenic. All right, omega-6s are important because linoleic acid examples can be in something such as walnuts all the way to vegetable oils. So vegetable oils, so we're just continuously going, a little bit more in depth with each one of these definitions. Vegetable oils, which are linoleic acids, contain many items such as seed oils, things like canola oil, soybean oil, etc. But they also technically contain fruit oil items, such as avocado oil and olive oil. Remember, those are mainly monounsaturated. So technically, because vegetable oils can incorporate avocado oil and olive oil, they're not the same thing when we use them in common everyday language. So like when someone's like, I'm avoiding vegetable oils, they're not really speaking on monounsaturated fats. In fact, people who avoid vegetable oils tend to flock towards monounsaturated fats. Even something like coconut oil can technically be considered a vegetable oil, although no one really uses that term, but I'm just trying to give some definitions. Coconut oil, once again, is mainly saturated fat. So from this point on, I'm going to be referencing seed oils as highly processed linoleic acid containing fats and fruit oils as separate from the large vegetable oil term. I know it's a whole mumbo jumbo of words, but just think, I'm going to go back here. A seed oil is linoleic acid, which is an omega 6 containing fat, right? Which is polyunsaturated fat. Some people make the mistake of thinking all linoleic acid is the same as seed oils, right? Or vice versa. It's technically not like that. I'll explain it more as we go in depth and really try to hammer that point home as well, because people get lost in the language. But here's some definitions for you. All right, so how do we take all this and we put it into a real diet context? So, knowing about these food sources of different dietary fats, foods themselves can therefore be seen as packages, not isolated molecules. So, for example, although cheese is higher in saturated fats, it also contains calcium and protein. Nuts contain a high amount of unsaturated fats, but also polyphenols. Olive oil contains monounsaturated fats, but also phenolitics, which is just like, think antioxidants, healthy plant compounds, right? So food matrix matters. And what I have here is just some definitions of polyphenols and phenolics are plant-based secondary metabolites and phytochemicals, often acting as antioxidants, right? Polyphenols, these are complex, high molecular weight plant compounds containing more than one phenolic unit, such as flavonoids, phenolic acids, stilbenes, and lignans. You can get into the weeds with this. Just think, when you eat an orange, and this is a cool example, when you eat an orange or a berry, there are things chemically that give it the color, that give it the smell, that give it the way that it tastes. All of these are considered beneficial plant compounds, and a lot of those are antioxidants. I always say this, but we'll speak more on what an antioxidant is as we continue on. But just know that foods contain more than just the fat in the food, right? So an olive oil is more than just a monounsaturated fat. It's a whole matrix of other things surrounding it. And when we start to look at foods like that, rather than just, this is a good source of fat, this is a bad source of fat, or whatever it might be, you really start to open your world up to making correct dietary choices. So, as we go on, the key idea about fats, and this is a big take-home point, there's stability, there's heat, and there's oxidation. So, due to their chemical compositions and ability to react to the environment, more double bonds in a fatty acid chain means a higher oxidation potential. There's a lot more on this in part 2. Saturated fats with their single bonds are generally more heat stable, while PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids, are more reactive. Exposure to air, light, temperature, and antioxidant content and the storage all matter for a fat's potential to oxidize. So an example is, when you get something like an olive oil, it's always recommended that you keep the lid on tight, right? So reduce oxygen. You have it in a dark vial, so you reduce light exposure, and you keep it in room temperature, so you try to reduce heat. All of these things are not just said for the fun of it. They're said because they're trying to reduce the rancidity. And when something goes rancid in terms of a fat, a lot of the times what we mean is it's now become oxidized. So oxidation is vastly oversimplified online, and we'll get exactly what oxidation is and the downstream inflammation biochemically, especially once again in part 2. We're really going to hit these points home. But for now, understand that a fat composition directly alters the physiology of an individual. What we have here is examples of free radicals. I like to explain free radicals or oxidation is, it's a game of hot potato that your body plays, and the hot potato, any cell that touches it can get damaged, right? So including DNA. So DNA damage can come from UV light. So that's things you've always heard, wear sunscreen. Air pollution, radiation, smoking, metabolism. So metabolism produces oxidation products. That's a pretty big thing. And inflammation. So oxidation, inflammation, those tend to go hand in hand. But what oxidation really is there's a free radical, meaning we have it, let's just say a compound, that it should have amounts of electrons in pairs. So, right, we have 2 electrons here, 2 electrons here, 2 here, but there's 1 missing. And because there's 1 missing, this thing will go and seek it. And when it wants to go and seek it, what it means is it'll go from cell to cell, body part to body part, and it'll try to take these electrons, and that induces damage. Now, an antioxidant comes into the play, and it has a free electron to donate. So basically, if we think of free radicals as a domino, right? So we have dominoes that are continuously falling. An antioxidant is something that comes and catches it. So it stops further dominoes from falling. That is the power of an antioxidant, right? So let's go ahead and open this up and we'll continue here. All right, so what we have here is a very complicated paper talking about the chemistry of deep fat frying oils. And this goes in more depth than I care to explain over this video because it's just a bunch of chemical names and we talk about the processes. So like here's an example, right? So we have something, we have the initiation, propagation, termination. This is usually like the oxidation reaction. We have something here where we continue and we're looking at the different heating times. We continue down, even more processes of a cyclic polymer formation of oleic acid during deep fat frying. So oleic acid is a very typical fatty acid, monounsaturated, found in olive oil. So like I said, it's very complicated, but the best way to summarize what this paper is saying is we have deep fat frying. And remember, deep fat frying is typically done with polyunsaturated vegetable oils, right? Canola, soybean, etc. And what this means is we have polyunsaturated, so remember, more than one double carbon bond type of fatty acid going in an environment where it's not really supposed to be in because of the composition of those double bonds, right? Because we have more of those double carbon bonds or those double carbon bonds. What we have is an increased likelihood of creating a really bad hot potato game. And deep fat frying is probably the worst environment you can put these very unstable oils in because you're almost guaranteeing the ability to increase oxidative species. And that's what this paper talks about, is a lot of the things that are induced because of the process of deep fat frying. So there's a replenishment of fresh oil. That's something that can impact the typical way that oxidation can occur. But think about it. If you like go to your typical or your local fast food restaurant, ask them how often they replenish their oil until they think it's dirty, or maybe once a week. So it's just, even keeping the oil, right? If I have canola oil and I keep it on a shelf and some sun hits it, I'm inducing oxidation. Let alone if I keep that same oil for a week in 400 plus degree temperatures, right? Continuously impacting with various amounts of food. I mean, just once you think about it like that, it is impossible not to induce large amounts of oxidation. So it's not just, is it being oxidized? The question is it already oxidized before due to storage? And now, how badly am I inducing oxidation during deep fat frying? So not to be like, don't think, oh, I can never have a deep fat fried food in my life, right? But just know that when you do consume these foods, you're introducing a large amount of very damaging particles to your body. Now, your body has ways to fight it, antioxidants, right? Examples like vitamin C in water, vitamin E in fat soluble components. But there's going to be a point where your body's like, I can't fight this anymore. So just keep that in mind, right? Frying time and temperature, it impacts the amount of oxidation. Quality of frying oil, it impacts the amount of oxidation, right? All of these things showcase that when you have oils in an environment like this, there's so many different things that can introduce oxidation. And oxidation is a giant domino effect of downstream negative products. So antioxidants themselves, kind of like I was talking about. Some foods have naturally present antioxidants. Some are stripped when they're processed, but that's a thing that can either decrease oxidation in the food itself, or if your body has those components, it can decrease it once it's introduced into your body. But like I said, this goes into a lot of depth, but I just wanted to explain deep fat frying oil as an example of direct oxidation induction. And it happens, and it will, no matter what. So I'm not going out to eat today because of this, but just keep that in mind. So now that we have a lot of the foundational information in terms of what we're speaking about, right? Fats, the names, the oxidation, all those things, what actually helps with health outcome determinants, right? So dietary fats' impact on health depend on things like total diet pattern, calorie balance, fiber, metabolic health, physical activity, genetics, etc. Meaning, one fat is not going to be the same in one person compared to another because we have all these other little nuanced things. I mean, we talked about this before, even in my last video, but each person is going to have a different impact even on the same change. right? So if I replace saturated fats for polyunsaturated fats in one person, it might completely change the outcome for them. But in someone else who might not be as metabolically healthy, maybe it didn't, or vice versa, things like that. So that's important to keep in mind. There can be a vast difference of simply replacing one fat with another versus actively changing the lifestyle around a certain diet. I think a great example of this is the Mediterranean diet, often quoted as the most healthy diet in the world. So if we look up to the left here, we have a Mediterranean diet plate recommendations. Just think lots of vegetables, lots of whole grains, good amount of fruit, almost no red meat. I mean, you've heard this before, right? This is the typical old style of American My Plate as well, or the old American pyramid. So if we look down to the bottom left, what we have here is the old versus new USA food recommendations. And on the left is the old. So we have lots of whole grains on the bottom, fruits and vegetables, small amounts of dairy and fat. So these two kind of go hand in hand. But it's important to know that it's not as simple as it sounds, because sadly, conversations constantly showcase a difference in opinions. There's a difference in research outcomes. Now, the overall consensus is the Mediterranean diet seems to be the most healthy. But if we go to the lifestyle surrounding the Mediterranean diet, think about that. In that area, such a high amount of physical activity, low amounts of other things that could decrease physical health, such as they're decreasing smoking. Now, some people might smoke till 90, but you can't look at an outlier for an example for a population. We've talked about that before. But the Mediterranean diet is not just a diet. That's the big overall point. It's a lifestyle. And because of that lifestyle, including some of the dietary components, there seems to be an overall increase in the health of the majority of the population. Now, back to the bottom left, we have the new USA Food Recommendation Pyramid, which just came out 1 or 2 months ago, at the beginning of 2026. And we have a complete flip of the pyramid. So at the top of the pyramid here, we have protein, dairy, and healthy fats seen as a huge component of what you should be eating. Fruits and vegetables, more so towards the top to the right area. And at the bottom, we have whole grains. So what this is doing is shifting, hey, we need to focus on proteins and fats and have carbohydrate sources as a lower quantity amount, right? We want the quality of those carbs to be good from whole grains, but we want the quantity to be lower. Once again, kind of going back to our old conversation. But my overall opinion, and the reason why I placed this, is it's important not to get stuck on one side or the other, because you can think that the Mediterranean diet is all you need to do to increase your health, but you're not working on anything else. Are you physically active? Do you have a good mental health? Do you have all these other things surrounding what the Mediterranean diet usually comes with in the countries of origin? And the new USA food recommendations, putting emphasis on protein, dairy, and healthy fats, could be beneficial to some. It could be detrimental to other people, right? The whole grains. Maybe some people need less whole grains if they're less physically active. Maybe they need more fruits and vegetables if they have certain, whatever it might be, health recommendations or needs of vitamins, micronutrients. So basically what I'm saying is it's not as simple as one diet is a fix-all for everyone. It never was going to be, and it really never is. That's why it's important to look at all the information and try to apply it either towards yourself or those that you might care about. Say, in my context. For example, in my context, I'm pretty physically active, at least where I am right now in my life, so I can have a higher amount of carbohydrate sources. I can look to healthier amounts of higher protein because of my weightlifting. But if my lifestyle changed and I became less physically active, maybe I don't need as much carbs in the morning. Maybe I don't need as much protein, I'm not dropping down to zero, but not doing the amount that I'm doing now. So that's why it's so context dependent, and it's really important not to get stuck anywhere on one side versus the other. But these are two great examples of looking at a pretty huge difference in opinions. We have two completely different pyramids here, but one could work for completely different people. So keeping that in mind, let's go on here towards the end. The final foundations and the takeaway home from this PowerPoint is different fats have different structures that we looked at, namely within their fatty acid carbon-carbon bonds. These structural differences can and will influence metabolism. There's going to be a lot more on this later. Whole foods differ from refined oils and contain a matrix surrounding the fat components, meaning a fat is not just a fat. A fat is a fat within a food, and that food comes with a lot of other things, right? The context surrounding food choices, especially dietary fats, it warrants further consideration and is exactly what we can continue to speak on here soon. However, to properly discuss dietary fats and their impact on health, specifically heart health, we have to intelligently discuss the nuanced conversation of heart disease. And that, like I said, is a monster. That's going to be part two. And I hope you guys stick around for that. I just finished the PowerPoint within the last day or two here, and I tried my hardest. So if this was like a 4 out of 10 in terms of content and information, that's going to be a 9 or 10 out of 10. But I will do my best to go through it step by step. We're going to explain what heart disease is, all the nuance around it, the definitions surrounding it. But if you can come home today as a takeaway message from this PowerPoint is know that dietary fats are not simple. They're complex, and they can be as complex as you want them to be. But it's important to know that each fat is not the same, and there's reasons why different fats have different health outcomes. And now that we have that, let's go ahead and take a look at heart disease coming up here next. But I'm glad you guys stuck around for this. I hope it was informative, not too boring, and it gave you a step stool to be able to really start to look at the conversation, the beginnings of fats conversations in terms of nutrition, and we'll build that confidence up, especially with heart health, and finally part 3 with seed oils. So thank you guys for being here. Hope it was enjoyable, and I will see you guys here soon for part 2.